It was the middle of May, the absolute worst time of the year for any high school junior, because state testing week was finally upon us, bringing an overwhelming wave of anxiety that you could practically feel in the air. The air conditioner in room 212 was completely broken, leaving all of us drowning in a swamp of nervous sweat, stale air, and the overwhelming scent of cheap number 2 pencils. My best friend Sam was sitting 2 rows over, furiously tapping his pencil against his metal desk, which was a nervous habit he had possessed ever since we were in kindergarten together. Sam had type 1 diabetes, and usually he managed his condition like an absolute professional, always keeping a hidden stash of apple juice boxes and chalky glucose tablets safely tucked inside his heavy canvas backpack. But today, our regular, understanding homeroom teacher was out sick, and sitting at the front desk was Mrs. Sterling, a notorious substitute who treated every single classroom like a maximum security prison. Before the morning bell had even managed to ring, she had marched aggressively up and down the narrow aisles, carrying a large gray plastic bin, demanding that we surrender our phones, our smartwatches, and even our snacks. Sam had tried to explain, speaking very politely and keeping his voice low, that his continuous glucose monitor was physically attached to his arm, and that he desperately needed his phone to check his blood sugar levels. Mrs. Sterling just rolled her eyes, let out this dramatically exaggerated sigh, and told him that she had heard every ridiculous excuse in the book, and that cheating would absolutely not be tolerated in her presence. She snatched his expensive smartphone right out of his shaking hand, tossed it carelessly into the hard plastic bin, and told him that if he argued any further, she would rip up his state test booklet and fail him on the spot. I could instantly see the sheer panic washing over Sam's face, his skin already looking a little too pale and clammy under those horrible, buzzing, fluorescent lights that gave everyone a headache. He quietly asked, his voice barely above a whisper, if he could at least keep his emergency juice box on the corner of his desk, just in case his blood sugar dropped, because the intense heat in the room was already making him feel lightheaded. Mrs. Sterling slammed her flat hand down on his wooden desk, her wrinkled face turning this ugly shade of purple, and shouted that food and drinks were strict, non-negotiable violations of the state testing protocol. She aggressively grabbed his 3 juice boxes, walked all the way back to her messy front desk, and actually threw them right into the metal garbage can, looking back at him with this sick, triumphant smile on her face. "You will survive for 3 hours without a sugary treat," she snapped coldly, adjusting her thick glasses, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that his hands were visibly shaking against his desk. I quickly raised my hand, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, and tried to respectfully tell her that it was a literal, documented medical necessity. But she immediately threatened me with a 5-day suspension if I dared to speak another word. Once the thick, heavy test booklets were finally passed out, Mrs. Sterling did something that still gives me vivid, terrifying nightmares to this very day. She walked over to the heavy, reinforced wooden classroom door, turned the metal deadbolt until it clicked loudly in the silent room, and then slipped the only silver key right into her ugly, floral cardigan pocket. "Nobody leaves this room for any reason whatsoever until the final dismissal bell rings," she announced, her harsh voice echoing off the cinder block walls in the dead, terrifying silence of the classroom. For the first long hour, everything was relatively quiet, just the rhythmic sound of pencils scratching against paper, but I kept anxiously glancing over at Sam, watching him slowly and inevitably deteriorate. He was sweating right through his gray cotton t-shirt, his breathing becoming alarmingly shallow and erratic, and he kept resting his heavy head against the cold, hard surface of his desk. Suddenly, the heavy quiet was shattered by a loud, high-pitched, relentless beeping noise coming directly from the plastic confiscation bin at the front of the room. It was Sam's specialized medical alert application on his phone, frantically warning that his blood sugar was rapidly dropping to a dangerously low, critical level that required immediate medical intervention. Mrs. Sterling marched over to the bin, dug aggressively through the pile of expensive phones, and furiously silenced the blaring alarm, glaring at Sam like he had purposefully and maliciously interrupted her peaceful day. Sam weakly raised his hand, his thin arm trembling so violently that he could barely keep it suspended in the air, and whispered that he desperately needed to go to the nurse right now. "Sit down immediately," she barked loudly, not even bothering to look up from the trashy gossip magazine she had been reading, completely dismissing the obvious, terrifying fact that he was literally slurring his words. "Please," Sam begged, his voice cracking horribly, thick tears rapidly welling up in his panicked eyes. "I am completely crashing. I need real sugar. I need the school nurse." Mrs. Sterling stood up quickly, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and told him to stop being so incredibly dramatic, claiming that normal teenage anxiety over a simple math test was no valid excuse to disrupt the educational environment. I absolutely couldn't take the tension anymore, so I pushed my heavy chair back, the metal legs scraping loudly against the cheap linoleum floor, and ran desperately over to the garbage can to retrieve his juice. "Get back in your assigned seat this instant," she screamed at the top of her lungs, rushing over and physically blocking my path to the trash, her eyes wide with unhinged rage. "He is rapidly going into a diabetic coma," I yelled back directly into her face, not even caring for a single second if I got expelled, because Sam's eyes were literally starting to roll to the back of his head. My other brave friend, Chloe, jumped up from her desk in the back row, pulled out her hidden backup granola bar from her jeans pocket, and tried to urgently toss it across the room to Sam. Mrs. Sterling quickly intercepted it, snatching it right out of the air with terrifying speed, and threw it right out the open second-story window, actually laughing like this was all some kind of entertaining, funny game to her. "This entire generation is so pathetically weak," she muttered loudly, shaking her head in disgust, "always desperately claiming you have some special medical condition just to get out of doing a little bit of hard work." That was the exact, horrifying moment that Sam collapsed entirely, his limp body sliding sideways out of his desk desk chair and hitting the hard floor with a sickening, heavy thud. His long arms and legs immediately began to convulse violently. His jaw locked tight in a terrifying grimace, and thick white foam started gathering rapidly at the corners of his pale mouth. The entire classroom instantly erupted into pure, unfiltered chaos, with terrified kids screaming loudly, jumping up onto their desks, and desperately begging Mrs. Sterling to please just unlock the damn door. Instead of helping him, this absolute monster actually stepped cleanly right over Sam's shaking, convulsing body, walked calmly back to her desk, and crossed her arms as if nothing was happening. He is obviously faking a seizure to maliciously invalidate the entire state testing session, she announced proudly to the frantic room, completely detached from reality, while my best friend was literally dying on the floor. I dropped immediately to my knees right next to Sam, rolling his heavy body onto his side just like he had taught me to do years ago, while Chloe sprinted to the locked door and violently rattled the brass handle. "Open the door right now!" Chloe screamed hysterically, pounding her fists aggressively against the small, reinforced glass window of the door, her knuckles turning bone white and eventually bleeding. "Destruction of private school property," Mrs. Sterling noted calmly, pulling out a red pen and writing Chloe's full name down on a wooden clipboard, acting exactly as if we were just slightly misbehaving elementary children. I looked up at her, hot tears streaming rapidly down my panicked face, screaming that she was a literal murderer, that she was killing him right in front of our very eyes. Another quiet kid in our class, Marcus, suddenly ran to the front of the room, grabbed the heavy metal fire extinguisher right off the wall, and turned purposefully toward the locked door. "Don't you dare do that!" Mrs. Sterling shrieked loudly, finally showing a tiny, genuine crack of panic. But Marcus didn't even hesitate for a single solitary second. He swung the heavy red fire extinguisher with absolutely everything he had, smashing it forcefully through the reinforced glass of the door, sending sharp, jagged shards flying dangerously everywhere. He bravely reached his bleeding, cut arm through the jagged hole, found the interior latch mechanism, and threw the heavy door completely open, completely ignoring Mrs. Sterling as she frantically clawed at the back of his shirt. Terrified kids instantly flooded out into the busy hallway, screaming wildly for help, their panicked voices echoing loudly off the metal lockers, drawing concerned teachers from every single classroom on the second floor. Mr. Harrison, the incredibly kind biology teacher, pushed his way aggressively through the massive crowd, took one horrifying look at Sam convulsing violently on the floor, and immediately screamed for someone to call 911. Mrs. Sterling actually had the absolute, unbelievable audacity to stand there and tell Mr. Harrison that we had purposely orchestrated a massive, violent riot just to get out of taking our required state exams. The professional paramedics arrived exactly 8 minutes later, sprinting frantically down the long hallway with a rolling stretcher, forcefully pushing Mrs. Sterling right out of the way when she foolishly tried to block them. They worked urgently on Sam, right there on the dirty classroom floor, quickly injecting him with emergency liquid glucagon, frantically yelling out complicated medical terms that made my blood run completely cold. One of the older EMTs looked up, his weathered face looking grim and pale, and stated loudly that Sam's blood sugar was so dangerously low that it wasn't even registering on their professional, hospital-grade meters. They carefully loaded his still unconscious body onto the stretcher, rushing him urgently out the double doors, leaving the rest of us standing in a ruined classroom that looked like a literal, devastating war zone. I sat heavily on the floor, staring blankly at the empty juice box resting at the bottom of the trash can, my shaking hands covered completely in Marcus's blood from the broken window, feeling entirely, completely numb. That late afternoon, the school principal, Mr. Davis, called me, Chloe, and Marcus directly into his private office, and I honestly thought he was finally going to tell us that Mrs. Sterling had been arrested by the police. Instead, he quietly closed the window blinds, sat comfortably behind his massive mahogany desk, and told us firmly that we critically needed to keep this entire incident completely quiet for the sake of Sam's personal privacy. Mrs. Sterling was simply following strict state mandates regarding test security protocols, Mr. Davis said, his voice smooth and heavily calculated, sounding exactly like he had practiced this disgusting speech 100 times in the mirror. He actually threatened us directly, stating clearly that if we dared to speak to the local news or posted anything on social media, he would have us permanently expelled for destroying school property and violently inciting a riot. I looked right at him, my vision literally blurring with red-hot, uncontrollable rage, and asked him aggressively if he knew that Sam was currently lying in a pediatric intensive care unit, breathing only through a machine. Mr. Davis just sighed deeply, steepled his fingers together on his desk, and said coldly that Sam's personal inability to manage his own health was unfortunate, but it was absolutely not the school's legal responsibility. When I confidently walked out of that terrible office, I didn't feel scared or intimidated anymore. I just felt this cold, calculating, intense determination to burn their entire corrupt system completely down to the ground. That dark night, my anxious mom drove me straight to the hospital, where Sam's exhausted parents were sitting quietly in the bleak waiting room, looking exactly like they had aged 20 years in a single horrible afternoon. Sam's heartbroken mom hugged me tightly, sobbing so violently hard that her knees completely gave out, and told me that the doctors said the prolonged, severe hypoglycemia had caused massive, potentially irreversible brain damage. Sam was currently trapped in a medically induced coma, and the specialists honestly didn't know if he would ever wake up, or if he would even be the exact same person if he miraculously miraculously did. I slowly walked into his quiet, dark hospital room, listening to the rhythmic, absolutely terrifying sound of the mechanical ventilator breathing for him, and I gently held his limp, freezing cold hand. I promised him right then, whispering softly into the quiet room, that Mrs. Sterling and Principal Davis were absolutely going to pay for every single torturous second of suffering they selfishly put him through. The very next morning, Chloe, Marcus, and I met quickly at the local diner before school started, bringing heavy notebooks, charged laptops, and a burning, undeniable desire for absolute, undeniable justice. Chloe proudly pulled out her smartphone and played a hidden audio recording she had amazingly managed to secretly capture during the terrifying chaos in the locked classroom. It was incredibly crystal clear, perfectly capturing Mrs. Sterling laughing cruelly, calling us weak, and explicitly, undeniably stating that she had locked the door and purposely hidden the key in her pocket. "This is our absolute smoking gun," Marcus said firmly, his right arm thickly wrapped in white medical bandages from the window glass, his dark eyes burning with intense, focused anger. We all deeply knew we absolutely couldn't trust the school district anymore. So my supportive parents helped us quickly find a ruthless, brilliant civil rights attorney named Ms. Vance, who had a legendary reputation for completely destroying corrupt school boards. We confidently sat in her beautiful high-rise office downtown, playing the secret audio recording for her, and I happily watched Ms. Vance's eyes light up fiercely, exactly like a predator suddenly spotting its vulnerable prey. She confidently told us that actively locking the door instantly elevated this situation from simple, ordinary negligence to severe false imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and willful, malicious child abuse. Ms. Vance immediately filed a massive, incredibly detailed lawsuit against Mrs. Sterling, Principal Davis, and the entire corrupt school district, aggressively demanding millions of dollars and pushing for immediate, severe criminal charges. When the massive lawsuit officially hit the public record, it was exactly like a massive, devastating bomb went off in our normally quiet, boring suburban town. Principal Davis frantically sent out an emergency, heavily worded email to all the parents, defensively calling our lawsuit a completely frivolous attack by angry, disgruntled students who just selfishly wanted their 15 minutes of fame. But we were completely ready for his pathetic lies. So Chloe immediately uploaded the unedited audio recording directly to every single social media platform, aggressively tagging every major local news station in the entire state. The terrifying recording went absolutely viral within 3 short hours, quickly amassing millions of angry views, with thousands of outraged, screaming people heavily demanding that Mrs. Sterling be permanently thrown in a federal prison cell. Huge news vans permanently parked on the green front lawn of our high school, aggressively shoving large microphones right into Principal Davis's sweaty face as he scrambled frantically to his car, looking completely terrified and incredibly pathetic. The terrified district immediately panicked, instantly placing Principal Davis on unpaid administrative leave, and nervously released a public statement falsely claiming they were deeply disturbed by the substitute's completely unauthorized, rogue actions. But Miss Vance absolutely wasn't going to let them off that easily. She aggressively subpoenaed Mrs. Sterling's entire, decades-long employment history, digging incredibly deep into her shady, hidden past. During the intense legal discovery phase, we shockingly uncovered hidden documents officially proving that Mrs. Sterling had actually been quietly fired from 3 previous, entirely different school districts for actively denying students access to their emergency asthma inhalers and life-saving EpiPens. Principal Davis had completely, willfully ignored her massive, glaring red flags, lazily hiring her anyway simply because she was incredibly cheap and willingly available to proctor the miserable state exams at the absolute last minute. When we triumphantly released those damning documents directly to the eager press, the overwhelming public outrage rapidly reached a terrifying boiling point, leading to massive, incredibly loud protests directly outside the main school board headquarters. Furious parents held up huge, colorful signs with Sam's smiling face heavily printed on them, chanting aggressively for the immediate, forced resignation of the entire superintendent, while loud news helicopters circled constantly overhead. 2 highly stressful weeks later, the local district attorney finally bowed completely to the immense, crushing public pressure and officially issued a felony arrest warrant for Mrs. Sterling. I was sitting quietly in my living room eating dinner when I shockingly saw it happen completely live on national television. Armed police officers forcefully escorting Mrs. Sterling right out of her suburban house in shiny, heavy silver handcuffs. She looked incredibly messy, absolutely terrified, and completely bewildered by the situation, shouting hysterically at the flashing reporters that she was the absolute real victim here, that she was just heroically maintaining traditional classroom discipline. Seeing her publicly humiliated in tight handcuffs absolutely brought a momentary, wonderful wave of deep relief. But Sam's incredibly brave parents flatly refused to sign the strict non-disclosure agreement. They passionately wanted the entire listening world to know exactly, precisely what had happened, so that no other innocent child would ever be locked in a dark room and left to die horribly by an abusive, power-hungry teacher. Ms. Vance aggressively took the entire school district to open court, and the resulting trial was absolutely the most grueling, emotionally exhausting, terrifying month of my entire young life. I bravely had to sit on the hard wooden witness stand, gripping the railing until my knuckles turned completely white, and recount every single horrific, bloody detail of that terrifying day to a silent courtroom. I clearly described the gross smell of the nervous sweat, the loud, piercing sound of the medical alarm, and the horrific, sickening thud of Sam's heavy heavy body violently hitting the floor, making absolutely sure the jury felt our genuine terror. Mrs. Sterling's incredibly expensive defense attorney tried desperately to completely tear me apart, falsely claiming I was heavily exaggerating my emotional memory, actually suggesting that Sam had deliberately, maliciously neglected his morning breakfast just to cause a dramatic scene. I completely, totally lost my temper on the stand, aggressively screaming directly into the small microphone that she had cruelly laughed while he literally choked on his own saliva, and the shocked judge actually had to call a 15-minute recess. When they finally played the secret, terrifying audio recording loudly in the packed courtroom, you could actually hear normal people in the crowded gallery heavily gasping and openly crying into their hands. The angry jury deliberated quietly for surprisingly less than 4 total hours, before confidently returning with a massive guilty verdict on every single count, including felony child endangerment and severe false imprisonment. The stern judge looked heavily down at Mrs. Sterling, his old face a perfect mask of absolute, unhidden disgust, and firmly sentenced her to 8 long years in a maximum security state prison, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. He also forcefully ordered the negligent school district to immediately pay a staggering, record-breaking punitive damage award, completely, totally bankrupting their massive legal defense fund, and aggressively forcing the immediate resignation of the entire corrupt school board. Disgraced Principal Davis was aggressively stripped of his administrative educational license permanently, guaranteeing that he would never, ever be legally allowed to work in any educational system ever again. It was a massive, incredibly sweeping public victory, a complete, undeniable validation of absolutely everything we had furiously fought for. But the loud celebration felt somewhat hollow when I quietly walked back into the bright hospital that same night. Sam had miraculously, wonderfully finally woken up from his dark coma a single week before the final verdict, but the honest doctors were unfortunately right. The lasting physical damage was incredibly severe and utterly heartbreaking. He sadly had to painfully relearn how to walk slowly, how to hold a simple metal fork, and how to speak quietly without his words slurring together in a deeply confusing, frustrating mess. I sat quietly by his soft bed, gently holding his warm hand, and softly told him that we had actually won, that the cruel monster who hurt him so badly was finally locked deeply in a cage exactly where she belonged. He looked slowly at me, his tired eyes taking a very long time to fully focus, and he gently squeezed my fingers, giving me a weak, somewhat crooked smile that absolutely, completely broke my heart into a million tiny pieces. The active state legislature eventually finally passed a massive, incredibly important bill, officially named Sam's Law, which officially made it a severe federal crime for any employed educator to maliciously deny a student total access to emergency medical supplies. It also strictly mandated that every single public classroom must permanently have an unlocked, highly accessible medical kit, and that classroom doors could absolutely never, ever be locked from the inside during regular school hours. Chloe, Marcus, and I stood proudly on the wide stone steps of the beautiful state capitol building, happily watching the smiling governor officially sign the important bill right into law, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past terrible year finally lift completely off our tired shoulders. We had actively taken the absolute worst, most deeply traumatic day of our young lives, and successfully turned it into a powerful, undeniable weapon that completely destroyed a horribly corrupt system and beautifully protected thousands of other innocent kids. A few long years have slowly passed since that horrible, dark May afternoon, and we have all successfully graduated and moved safely on to college, actively trying to carefully piece our completely changed lives back together. Sam still unfortunately struggles daily with his fine motor skills, and he strictly requires painful physical therapy exactly 3 times a week. But his incredibly bright spirit is exactly the same as it beautifully was long before the terrible incident. Every single time I happen to see a quick news story about an angry teacher abusing their given power, or a corrupt school trying desperately to sweep a massive tragedy cleanly under the rug, my blood still runs incredibly cold. But then I happily remember the loud, echoing sound of the stern judge reading that guilty verdict, the beautiful sight of the heavy silver handcuffs clicking tightly around Mrs. Sterling's wrists, and the incredible power we found when we bravely refused to be completely silent. We absolutely proved that when abusive authority figures actively try to totally crush you, when they maliciously lock the heavy doors and hide the keys, you definitely don't just sit there quietly and take the abuse. You bravely break the damn glass windows, you fiercely scream incredibly loud until your throat bleeds, and you absolutely destroy their entire lives until there is absolutely nothing left of their careers but smoking ashes. They honestly thought we were just weak, overly dramatic kids who would eventually quietly back down, but they learned the incredibly hard way that we were an absolute, undeniable force of nature that they absolutely couldn't control. Mrs. Sterling is currently wonderfully sitting in a tiny, heavily locked cell, completely surrounded by cold concrete walls, finally understanding exactly, precisely how poor Sam felt when she cruelly took away his only absolute lifeline. The concept of justice isn't always perfectly fair, and it absolutely doesn't always completely heal the deep emotional wounds, but actively making the horrible people who hurt you deeply pay heavily for their crimes is a damn good place to confidently start. I still constantly keep an extra, unopened apple juice box tucked safely in my heavy purse every single day, just in case someone ever desperately needs it, because you absolutely never know exactly when you might have to suddenly save a fragile life. And if I ever, unfortunately, see another power-hungry teacher trying to maliciously play God with an innocent student's vulnerable health, I definitely won't just stand quietly by. I will absolutely tear their entire pathetic world apart all over again.